Mr. Vartian, thank you very much for coming to Voice of America today and having the willingness to speak with us. Today, we would like to discuss certain issues related to the Armenian Genocide Memorial Museum that supposedly will be built sometime in the near future, and the controversial issues that relate to this issue. The process started basically back in 2000, more than a decade ago now, where two major players were involved in this: the Armenian Assembly with Mr. Hovnanian in it, and the Cafesjian Family Foundation with Mr. Cafesjian. Would you give us just a little bit of a prehistory about the process, how this was all done, although this was reported in so many ways on the English language newspapers, but as our target audience is also the public in Armenia, I would like to speak a little bit of about the history and the process.
Oh, I'd be happy to briefly talk about the history. I think that throughout the diaspora, there's always been the hope of one day having an Armenian Genocide Museum and Memorial somewhere in the world to tell our story, just as the museum and memorial does in Yerevan. And in this case, Mr. Hovnanian, Mrs. Anush Matevosyan, and Mr. Jerry Cafesjian were each thinking about this in their own different ways and separate ways. Mr. Hovnanian in creating the Armenian National Institute, Ms. Matevosyan in offering the first pledge to acquire a building in Washington, D.C., and Mr. Cafesjian being both an assembly activist and also interested in this subject, responding to Ms. Matevosyan's pledge with his own strong interest in acquiring a property in Washington. And this was all 1999, the year 2000. We were looking actively for a site somewhere in Washington, and most of them were too small or too expensive, but this one, as they say, was just right. The National Bank building at the corner of 14th and G. Unfortunately, it was $7 million. Ms. Matevosyan's pledge was $3.5 million, and she didn't have cash in time to be part of the acquisition. Mr. Cafesjian loved the site, provided 100% of the capital, including a no-interest loan to Ms. Matevosyan, and a $500,000 loan to the Armenian Assembly to help the transaction happen. So essentially he provided 100% of the financing to acquire the bank building. And then over the next few months, he acquired adjacent properties, investing over $15 million in real estate acquisition. He was the sole activist when it comes to acquiring properties next to the bank. And as I said, he financed entirely the acquisition of the bank property.
Well, money is one of the issues on this, of course, an important issue, considering that this is probably one of the largest projects, if not the biggest project for the Armenian Americans, specifically in Washington, D.C. But the management, or the way it was set up from the very beginning, the board, involved not only Ms. Matevosyan and Jared Cafesjian, but also Mr. Hovnanian, Mr. Van Grigorian, and others from the assembly. What was the original idea of the board? What were the stakeholders' positions and rights on this? And when did the conflict arose between the board members? What were the reasons for the conflict?
I'd say there was essentially two chapters in the board management of this project. The first chapter was when it was part of the Armenian Assembly. It was actually an assembly project. Until it became so large that the assembly wisely chose to spin it off as an independent entity so that the entire community could participate. In both instances, the individuals that you named were board members and activist officers in company number one when it was part of the Armenian Assembly, and company number two when it was spun off as an independent. They had equal rights. Passage of decisions required a supermajority, so that essentially everyone had to buy in. It was essentially consensus. It was essentially unanimous consent, so that all voices would be heard and all votes would be taken into account. I would say the conflict began early on with two versions of how we ought to proceed with this project. The one version promoted by Mr. Cafesjian was to use not only the bank building, but all of the adjacent properties that he acquired to build a very large museum. When we say large, we have to compare it to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, for example, which is approximately 400,000 square feet. Developing our full footprint that Mr. Cafesjian put together would be about 125,000 square feet. So while it sounds like a lot, you have to put it in the context of other historical museums in Washington, D.C.
Sure.
We were on the medium size, not the very large size. Mr. Hovnanian preferred a much more modest approach to this, which would be the bank building and an adjacent lot. So a smaller footprint, a more manageable budget, because he was always concerned about the community's ability to pay. So the conflict began over the size and scope of this project right from the beginning. Spirited debate, differences of opinion, resulting, unfortunately, in no movement.
Well, it sparked into, at the beginning, if it was related to how big the museum should be, or the design, or the funding, and issues like that, at some point, sides decided to solve their issues at the court. It's been a long court case, a long litigation, a lot of resources by different estimates, probably over a couple of $1 million from each side. And finally, this year, just a couple of months ago, the court in Washington decided basically in favor of Mr. Cafesjian. After this, the court decision is basically being in hold with the side coming from the Hovnanian side going for another court process. Or would you please explain what happened in the court, what was the decision of the judge, and what is happening now, and what can it bring us to?
Yes, the two sides ultimately ended up in court last November and spent a considerable amount of time in court making their case. Each side had the full opportunity to do so. The judge ruled on that case that she heard in November, the end of January. And in the end of January, her basic ruling was that all of the properties would revert back to Mr. Cafesjian because nothing had been done on that site for 10 years. And his conditional grant required that the properties be given back to the Cafesjian Family Foundation, not Mr. Cafesjian personally, when that date expired. And the court said a contract is a contract, it must be honored. And therefore, the judge upheld the reversion clause of those properties going back to the Cafesjian Family Foundation, number one. Number two, all of the charges made against Mr. Cafesjian by Mr. Hovnanian were rejected by the court entirely. The third part of her verdict was that $500,000 loan that I described earlier, interest-free, from Mr. Cafesjian to the Armenian Assembly. He had requested that that be paid. The judge said it was a legitimate obligation on the part of the Assembly, but the statute of limitations had expired. And I'd say the final major thing that the judge said was that Mr. Cafesjian was entitled to recover a substantial portion of his legal fees because all of the charges leveled against him were false. Specifically, the judge said on the properties that they should revert back to Cafesjian Family Foundation effective December 31 of last year. I naively hoped that the day after that verdict, the keys and the title would be transferred to the Cafesjian Family Foundation and we could do the project. Mr. Cafesjian was asked in court, what would you do if you won? And Mr. Cafesjian said on behalf of his foundation that we would go to the entire Armenian community, we would do this project using the full footprint just as we had promised to the community 10 years before.
Well, the court decision, right after the court decision, Mr. Cafesjian came up with a statement saying this means that the dream of the Genocide Museum is alive, saying that basically his the counterpart was trying to abolish the idea. There have been a lot of dirty talk on this issue. Setting that aside, now the Assembly side, specifically Mr. Van Krikorian and Mr. Hovnanian, are continuing the process. They have basically, they didn't appeal, but they're actually putting the court decision under doubt. A couple of arguments there. One of the arguments is that they have found basically a donation where Mr. Cafesjian and the judge herself have made donations from their collections, and that is a conflict of interest. Stuff like this. By this also basically asking for another judge to look at the case and to basically come up with a different verdict. Where can this lead us to? How long can the pause continue? Because as far as we see, the keys are not given to the Cafesjian Foundation, and Assembly's office today is in one of those buildings.
Yes, I would say that A general comment first, that this delay is not only unfortunate, it's irresponsible. Time is our enemy. This project must be done, and this museum must be open by April 24, 2015. It's only 4 years away. We need to be in a much bigger hurry than we are. Mr. Ovnanian and Mr. Krikorian lost at trial, and demanding a new trial will fail. The allegations of bias are close to absurd. The allegation of somehow being connected to the President Clinton, will not stand. And the allegation of both families collecting art and having an interest in the same kind of art would disqualify most judges from ruling on almost anything, because presumably judicial families like art just like any other family. So there's bound to be an intersection at some point between people appearing before their bench and their similarities in art. Maybe they like Scotch as well. Maybe they like baseball as well. I mean, this is irrelevant. And our lawyers are very confident that when the judge issues her final ruling, these issues will be taken care of, just as the false charges against Mr. Cafesjian were taken care of. Look at this in perspective. The losing side really didn't have a case, so they attacked Mr. Cafesjian's credibility and failed. Now, having lost at trial, they are now attacking the credibility of the judge. So it's a repeat of the same approach, and it will fail as well. In terms of timing, which is the most important issue, all of the briefs are now in. There are no more briefs to file before this judge. She now has to convene her last status hearing, and then she will issue her final verdict. In the final verdict, which is appealable, of course, in her final verdict, she will predictably deal with the property issue that will not be appealed. And the property will then transfer rather immediately from the current ownership to the Cafesjian Family Foundation, and we will begin to do this project with the Armenian community as broadly as possible, as quickly as possible. My hope is that this entire process will be done no later than June 1st, and we can begin this project.
So if I understand you correctly, no matter, after the final verdict, no matter whether the other side appeals or not, the property will be transferred to the Cafesjian Foundation.
That is correct. That is what our lawyers indicate will happen.
Going into the issue of the future,
yes.
As I hear, the target is the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, and this is basically 4 years, which
Yes.
is not a long time for a huge project like this.
Correct.
Where does the foundation look for support on this? And the support is not only the financial support, which is crucial, of course. We hear different estimates: $80 million, $100 million, maybe more. If you have a better understanding of this or knowledge of this, please share with us. And content-wise, who is getting involved? Professionals, people like Ruben Adalian, who has been involved in this, has been in the court case, but has the capacity, knowledge. People like him, scientists, scholars, museum specialists. Please, a couple of words about this.
Well, you've identified pretty much all the groups that need to be involved. We need to have community leaders. All Armenian organizations, the homeland, individually and as a state, experts in all fields that relate to this subject, whether it's fundraising experts, social networking experts, museum, educators, academicians, essentially the entire artists, the entire Armenian American community, as well as throughout the diaspora and the homeland, is welcome to participate. We will have an open door for all organizations and any individual who can make a contribution. In this case, obviously, finances will be a dominant question because this will be the largest project we've ever attempted in the diaspora in the context of a budget. And so finances will be very, very important. But so will the message, so will the programs, and so will our ability to include any Armenian that's interested, plus obviously non-Armenians of goodwill.
Well, before we had the willingness of big Armenian names such as Krikorian and others donating to this project. Do they still have the willingness? Are they still?
We will see when we have the keys and the title. I've been brought back to lead the staff on this project, and I'm proud to do so. But we are concerned about reaching out to individuals like the ones you've mentioned and others before we have clear title to the property, because it'll be the first question. And if you can't answer that question, it makes appealing to other people quite difficult and challenging. And unfortunately, the losing side knows this. So the sooner that they abide by the verdict, the sooner we will be able to reach out to the community and move this project forward.
Do you have any specific mechanisms in mind on how you're going to involve people in this, in the decision-making process, in the design decision-making process, and others? Is there some kind of a board that is going to be created? Some things that you already have in mind?
Certainly, there will be a board of an independent, charitable organization. The board members will be known to the community far and wide, and they'll be respected members of our community. There will also be non-Armenians on the board who are well known on this subject and well known to the community, again, around the world. So it has to be diverse, it has to be prominent, and it has to be serious. I mean, those are the three criteria we're looking for board members. There will be working committees, of course. There'll be one on content, on building, on development, and on communication. So we've identified those 4 working committees that we will need professionals and volunteer activists across the board. There will be another body, to be named yet, where there will be our Armenian representation, Armenian institutional representation. There will be honorary committees so that individuals who are willing to lend their name but do not necessarily have the time to invest will also participate as honorary members and have the ability to hear what is going on and comment on what is going on. We will have a serious outreach effort, both in person and virtually, so that anybody that has something to say about this museum will be able to do so and have their voice heard. And we will also have a webcam on site so that anybody at any time can open up that site and monitor the progress as we go through demolishing the old buildings, constructing the new, and then finally retrofitting the bank building and then building out the museum and exhibit spaces. So it'll always be online, it'll always be available to anyone that is interested.
Setting aside the fact that this can become a major consolidation point for the Armenian American community, just on April 13th, when the annual genocide commemoration was taking place at the U.S. Senate this year, some of the congressmen and congresswomen were mentioning the importance of the Armenian Genocide Museum. What would be the congressional caucuses or the congressional support to this, especially considering the history of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is basically built by the congressional decision and is getting major funding from the U.S. state budget?
Yeah, the analogy between the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the to-be-named Armenian Genocide Memorial Museum is the key word U.S. In the case of the Holocaust Museum, it is officially part of the U.S. establishment, the government establishment. It is part of the Smithsonian. It receives a portion of its funding from the federal treasury, and there are members of the U.S. Senate and members of the U.S. House of Representatives that sit on the board of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In the case of the Armenian Genocide Museum and Memorial, we will probably not have that kind of official support, direct line from the Treasury with the direct participation of members of Congress as an act of law. But we will have members of Congress on our various boards. We will have very strong congressional support for the mission of this museum and memorial. And one day, we believe that by doing it properly, doing it Smithsonian standard, doing it at an appropriate scale, having the correct kinds of programs and involvement of the public, that one day it will also be part of the Smithsonian, but after the fact.
One last question.
Please.
About coming from the conspiracy theory perspective. Many have been basically speculating that the reason why the Memorial Museum was not, the Armenian Genocide Memorial Museum was not making any progress is also because the U.S. has not officially recognized the Armenian Genocide, and there is some kind of behind the curtains game going on there, plus the Turkish lobby that basically may have been working on this. Do we have any facts where we can acknowledge the fact that, or do we have any facts where it shows that the U.S. government or on various levels there has been difficulties brought up to this issue, and has the Turkish lobby in any ways been involved in this?
Well, there is no fact whatsoever to support that conspiracy theory, not one. not one that goes to the American government attempting to intervene or to slow things down, or the Turkish government. In this case, the advantage is that it's a private project. It's not a public project. So there's a disadvantage, of course, in not having the federal government, etc., but there's the advantage of this is private, and nobody can stop us.
Right.
So only people that can stop us are ourselves.
Right.
And historically, Armenians have been able to do that from time to time. On the other hand, when Armenians come together, we accomplish great things. And as soon as we have title to this property, everyone is going to be welcome to participate. No Turkish government.
Including the Armenian Assembly?
That is correct. No Turkish government, no American government can stop this from happening. We hope that the Armenian Assembly will not only stop preventing this from happening, but will have a very fundamental change in approach on this project and be interested in participating collaboratively and constructively. That's our hope.
Thank you, Mr. Vartian. I hope this works out, and by 2015 we will see an Armenian Genocide Memorial Museum standing there.
There must be one, and we should all be there.
Thank you.
Thank you.